December 17th, 1944. In the frozen darkness of the Ardennes forest, a Tiger tank engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the road fell silent. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic echo ringing through the cold air. Inside the hull, the driver tried again. The starter whined uselessly. The engine refused to turn over. The fuel gauge sat on 0. Moments later, the voice came up from below, tight, controlled, almost disbelieving. The reserve tank was empty too. Peiper climbed down from the turret. His boots crunched against frozen Belgian soil as he looked forward along the narrow road, then back behind him. As far as he could see, vehicles sat motionless. Tiger tanks, Panthers, half-tracks, fuel trucks, 67 tanks and nearly 5,000 elite Waffen-SS soldiers stopped without a shot fired. This was not a retreat. This was not a delay. This column was the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive in the West, and before the battle had truly begun, it had run out of fuel. As the first light of dawn crept through the Ardennes fog, Peiper moved forward on foot toward the village ahead. Hansfeld. According to German maps, it was a minor American position, a temporary supply stop, nothing that should have slowed the advance, let alone saved it. But something immediately felt wrong. There was no defensive fire, no movement in the streets, no sign of a hurried last stand. The village looked abandoned. Peiper passed empty foxholes, their edges still sharp in the frozen ground. Rifles lay where they had been dropped. Packs sat open in the snow. In several places, oil drums still burned, their flames flickering weakly in the morning air. And everywhere there was the smell. Fuel. Hot metal. Fresh coffee. American coffee. It was still warm. Inside one position, metal cups sat beside half-eaten rations. The men who had been here had not retreated days earlier. They had left in haste, minutes, perhaps hours before. Then, Peiper reached the edge of the village and stopped. Beyond the last row of buildings, stretching across an open field, stood rows of containers unlike anything he had ever seen in such numbers. American jerry cans, olive drab, rectangular, identical. They were stacked in long, precise lines, 3 meters high in places, forming low walls of steel that ran hundreds of meters across the field, thousands of them. For a moment, no one spoke. An adjutant pried open one can with a bayonet. The cap came loose with a sharp metallic snap. He leaned down, inhaled once, then looked up sharply. Gasoline. High-octane American gasoline. The reaction was instant. Men shouted. Fuel hoses appeared. Jerry cans were dragged toward waiting vehicles. Tank crews scrambled back into their machines. Engines that had been silent since dawn roared back to life. The frozen road that had been dead, only moments earlier, began to vibrate again with sound. Peiper walked slowly among the stacks, his gloved hand brushing cold steel as he looked around in disbelief. This was not a small cache. This was not an emergency reserve. This was a flood. As the refueling continued, Peiper did not join in the celebration. He stood apart, watching. Jerry cans were passed hand to hand. Fuel hoses snaked across the frozen ground. Engines drank greedily after hours of starvation. Men laughed with the nervous energy of soldiers pulled back from the edge, but Peiper's eyes kept moving. He began counting, not carefully at first, just estimating. Rows, stacks, distances. He had spent years commanding armored units on the Eastern Front. He knew fuel. He knew what an army consumed, and what he saw did not make sense. An officer approached him with an initial estimate, then another. The numbers were rough, but they were consistent. 50,000 gallons, Peiper said the number again in his head, slower this time. 50,000. It was more fuel than his entire Kampfgruppe had received in months, more than many German divisions had been allocated in half a year, enough to move every tank, every truck, every half-track under his command, enough, on paper, to reach the Meuse River. For a moment it felt like deliverance. The offensive could continue. The timetable could still be met. The gamble might still pay off. But as Peiper stood among the stacks, something began to unsettle him. This depot had not been fortified. It had not been camouflaged. It had not been booby-trapped. The Americans had simply left it. They had walked away from 50,000 gallons of fuel as if it were nothing more than excess baggage. Peiper looked beyond the field, back toward the empty village. This was not a major supply hub, it was a forward depot, a temporary fueling point for frontline units, one of many. If this was what the Americans could abandon in a single position, without hesitation, then the scale of what they possessed elsewhere was almost impossible to imagine. An adjutant remarked that it was a gift, a miracle. Peiper did not answer, because standing there, watching German tanks refuel with American gasoline, he felt a realization begin to settle over him, slow, heavy, and unavoidable. This fuel did not represent American weakness, it represented American confidence. They could afford to lose it, and if they could afford this, then Germany was not merely outnumbered. Germany was fighting a war it could not even measure. As the column prepared to move again, engines rumbling back to life, Peiper climbed into his command tank. The road to the Meuse lay ahead, but somewhere in his mind, another thought had already taken hold. What looked like salvation that morning was something else entirely. It was the first proof that the war had already been decided. To understand what Joachim Peiper realized that morning, one has to step back, months earlier, far from the Ardennes. By early 1944, Germany was already running on fumes. The Third Reich had never possessed large natural oil reserves. From the beginning of the war, its entire military machine depended on synthetic fuel, gasoline distilled from coal in vast industrial plants scattered across Germany. Those plants had been Germany's lifeline, and by the spring of 1944, the Allies began to cut it. Wave after wave of heavy bombers targeted the hydrogenation facilities at Leuna, Pölitz, Blechhammer, and dozens of others. The attacks were systematic, relentless, and devastating. In April, German synthetic fuel production stood at hundreds of thousands of tons. By September, it had collapsed by more than 90%. The effects were immediate. The Luftwaffe began grounding aircraft not because of enemy fighters, but because there was nothing to put in their tanks. Pilot training was slashed from hundreds of flight hours to a fraction of what new aviators once received. Entire fighter units existed only on paper. On the ground, the German Navy's surface fleet was effectively immobilized. Submarines were forced to rely on batteries for longer periods, not for stealth, but to conserve diesel fuel. At home, civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the theft of a single liter could trigger a Gestapo investigation. Farmers returned to horse-drawn plows, tractors sat idle. By late 1944, Germany was attempting to fight a modern mechanized war with pre-industrial logistics. Every mile driven had to be justified. Every training exercise was a luxury. Every drop of fuel was measured, guarded, and rationed. This was the reality Peiper carried with him into the Ardennes. A reality in which 50,000 gallons of fuel was not just useful, it was unimaginable. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's strategic situation was collapsing on both fronts. In the east, the Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward the Reich itself. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. German commanders knew the war could no longer be won outright, but Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. Instead, he approved one final gamble, an offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route used in 1940. The plan was audacious, desperate, and built on a single assumption that speed and surprise could compensate for everything Germany no longer had. Fuel, most of all. German planners calculated the bare minimum needed to reach the Meuse River. The numbers were alarming. The offensive would require millions of gallons of gasoline, far more than Germany could actually supply. Hitler allocated roughly 5 million gallons for the entire operation. Even that was an illusion. Transportation breakdowns, Allied air attacks, and damaged rail networks meant that barely half of that fuel ever reached the frontline units. The rest existed only on paper. For Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, designated as the spearhead of the entire offensive, the margin was razor-thin. His unit was issued enough fuel for roughly 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse was 65. The shortfall was not a mistake. It was intentional. The plan assumed Peiper would capture American fuel depots along the way, fuel that would then keep the offensive alive. Without those depots, the advance would stall. Without abundance on the other side, it would die. Peiper understood this. Before the attack began, he issued strict orders. Vehicles would move in single file to conserve gasoline. Engines would be shut down during any halt longer than a few minutes. The capture of American fuel was to take priority over tactical objectives, more important than terrain, more important than enemy units, more important than time. From the very first day, Germany's last offensive was not powered by its own resources. It was powered by hope. What Peiper had stumbled upon at Hansfeld was not an accident. It was a fragment of a system, one so vast that losing 50,000 gallons of fuel barely registered. While German units rationed every liter, the American war effort operated on an entirely different scale. Behind the front lines, thousands of trucks moved day and night along a network known as the Red Ball Express. Convoys stretched for miles, engines never cooling, headlights dimmed but never extinguished. Drivers worked in shifts, pushing fuel, ammunition, and food forward without pause. Entire highways were reserved for supply traffic alone. Fuel flowed not in barrels, but in rivers. Across the English Channel, pipelines were laid along the seabed, pumping gasoline directly from Britain into France. These lines operated continuously, immune to traffic jams, immune to weather, immune to exhaustion. American fuel did not wait for trucks. It arrived underground at the front. U.S. divisions were resupplied not once or twice a week, but repeatedly. Fuel dumps were established, used, abandoned, and replaced as the armies advanced. What mattered was not conservation, but momentum. German soldiers noticed it immediately. In abandoned American positions, they found manifests, typed forms clipped neatly to crates. The documents listed origins that seemed unreal: Texas, California, Pennsylvania. Fuel refined in the United States, shipped across an ocean, unloaded in England, pumped under the sea, driven across France, and delivered to the front line in a matter of weeks. For German officers accustomed to rail shortages and horse-drawn wagons, it was incomprehensible. Even the American sense of time was different. Newspapers found in abandoned positions were dated days earlier, casually reporting the construction of new pipelines and refineries as if they were routine. Losses were acknowledged, then replaced. Shortages were solved before they became problems. By comparison, Germany's entire fuel reserve for the Ardennes offensive would barely sustain a single American army for a few days. And still, the fuel kept coming. What Peiper saw at Hansfeld was not extravagance. It was confidence, the confidence of an industrial power that knew it could replace anything it lost, faster than its enemy could even count it. As his column rolled forward once more, burning American gasoline to fuel German tanks, Peiper carried that knowledge with him. For the first time, the Ardennes offensive no longer felt like a battle of men and machines. It felt like a contest between scarcity and infinity. And scarcity was already losing. As Peiper pushed westward, the pattern repeated itself. American units fell back quickly. Roads were clogged with abandoned equipment. Fuel dumps appeared again and again, some captured, some destroyed, others simply bypassed in the chaos of retreat. Then, on December 18th, his column reached the outskirts of Stavelot. What lay there dwarfed everything Peiper had seen before. Along the banks of the Amblève River sat one of the largest American fuel depots in the region. Jerry cans stretched in every direction, stacked in towering rows, filling open fields, warehouses, and riverbanks alike. This was not tens of thousands of gallons. This was millions. Rough estimates placed the total at more than 2 million gallons of gasoline, enough to fuel Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe, not just to the Meuse, but far beyond it, enough to change the course of the offensive. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed real. If this fuel could be secured, the gamble might succeed, but the Americans understood exactly what was at stake. As German units advanced toward the depot, U.S. engineers received their orders. The fuel was not to be captured, it was not to be defended, it was to be destroyed. Gasoline was poured into trenches and ditches. Trails were laid deliberately through the stacks. Ignition charges were prepared with calm efficiency. Then the order was given. Flames erupted across the depot in a rolling wave. Jerry cans burst open as fire raced through the rows, igniting millions of gallons almost at once. A towering wall of flame rose into the winter sky, black smoke boiling upward, visible for miles. The heat was overwhelming. The roar drowned out artillery. The fire burned day and night, consuming fuel faster than Peiper's entire force could have burned it in months. German soldiers stood watching in disbelief. They were not witnessing denial. They were witnessing excess. The Americans were not destroying fuel because they had none to spare. They were destroying it because they had too much. As the smoke drifted over Stavelot and the depot burned itself into nothing but twisted metal and scorched earth, Peiper understood that he was no longer racing the clock. He was racing something far larger, a system that could afford to set fire to its own lifeblood and keep fighting as if nothing had been lost. Stavelot was not an isolated decision. Across Belgium and northern France, similar orders were being carried out. As German spearheads pushed forward, American units destroyed their own fuel dumps deliberately. Millions of gallons ignited, drained, or rendered useless before they could be captured. To the men watching from the roadside, it felt less like denial and more like spectacle. Fuel burned because it could. While German units scoured the countryside for a few hundred usable liters, entire American depots vanished in sheets of flame. And still, the advance did not slow. Behind the front, Allied logistics continued to operate at full capacity. Fuel convoys kept rolling, pipelines kept pumping, replacement depots were established even as old ones burned. The flow never stopped. Allied intelligence quickly grasped the significance of Peiper's situation. Intercepts revealed the German spearhead was starving for fuel. American commanders responded not by hoarding, but by accelerating. Aircraft were diverted to fly gasoline directly to surrounded units. At Bastogne, fuel was dropped by parachute alongside ammunition and food. What could not be spared on the ground was delivered through the air. In a single day of air operations, the Allies consumed more fuel than Germany had allocated to Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe for the offensive. The contrast was brutal. German tanks sat idle, engines cold, crews counting liters. American aircraft roared overhead, burning fuel without hesitation, without calculation, without fear of tomorrow. This was no longer a contest of tactics. Fuel itself had become a weapon. Not because it was rare, but because it was limitless on one side and vanishing on the other. For Peiper, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. He was not fighting an enemy that could be outmaneuvered. He was fighting an enemy that could simply outlast him by orders of magnitude. By the night of December 18th, the momentum was gone. Peiper's column had advanced farther than any other German unit in the Ardennes, but the cost was now impossible to ignore. Vehicles were scattered along the roads, some empty, some destroyed. Others simply abandoned where they had stopped. Fuel reports came in one by one. Numbers were crossed out, revised, reduced again. There was not enough gasoline to continue the advance. There was barely enough to maneuver. Retreat, if it came, would have to be done on foot. Inside a dimly lit command post, Peiper gathered his officers. The mood was no longer urgent. It was heavy, resigned. Maps lay spread across the table, but no one pointed to them anymore. The Meuse River remained marked in pencil, still out of reach, still distant. The problem was no longer distance, it was reality. One officer suggested another push, another proposed waiting for resupply. Both ideas faded as soon as they were, spoken. There was no resupply coming. The fuel they had captured at Hansfeld was nearly gone. What remained was being rationed to the leader, reserved for the wounded and for vehicles that might still move if needed. Peiper listened in silence. Then he spoke, quietly, without anger. What we captured, he said, was nothing to them. No one argued. They had seen it with their own eyes. Fuel dumps abandoned without a fight, millions of gallons burned deliberately, aircraft flying overhead as if gasoline were an afterthought. In that moment, Peiper understood something few German commanders had fully grasped until then. This was not a battle Germany had lost in the Ardennes. It was a war Germany had already lost elsewhere. In refineries, it could not protect. In factories, it could not match. In supply lines, it could not replace. The Ardennes offensive was still unfolding on the maps, but in that room, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war had been decided not by firepower, but by fuel. The end did not come with a final battle. It came quietly, along frozen roads and in dark forests, as engines fell silent one last time. One by one, German tanks were abandoned where they stood. Crews drained the last usable fuel from their vehicles, pouring it into canisters for the wounded or for the few machines that might still move. What could not be saved was destroyed. Explosive charges were set, breech blocks were removed, optics were smashed. Perfectly serviceable tanks, machines that had once symbolized German power, were reduced to burning hulks by their own crews. There were no enemy forces pressing them at that moment, no encirclement, no decisive engagement, just empty tanks. Orders filtered down through the column. Vehicles that could move were to proceed. Those that could not were to be left behind. Men were instructed to take only what they could carry. The mechanized spearhead of the offensive dissolved into a column of infantry. Soldiers who had crossed into Belgium riding in armored half-tracks now marched on foot through snow and mud, their breath clouding the cold air. Boots wore thin. Weapons grew heavier with every step. The road was littered with the remains of the advance, tanks without fuel, trucks without purpose, guns without tractors to pull them. This was not a defeat imposed by the enemy. It was a collapse imposed by absence. By the time Allied forces began pressing in earnest, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was no longer an armored formation. It was a retreating mass of men stripped of the very thing that had once made them formidable. The great gamble had not failed in fire or blood. It had simply stopped. What Joachim Peiper understood in the Ardennes was not unique for long. As the offensive unraveled, similar reports surfaced across the German front. Commanders spoke of fuel dumps too large to comprehend, of American supplies destroyed not out of desperation, but out of routine. Prisoners were questioned, trucks were searched, documents were examined. The same conclusion emerged again and again. The Americans were not struggling to supply their armies. They were struggling to use what they had fast enough. German officers returning from the front described it in stark terms. They spoke of fuel flowing freely while German units counted liters, of depots so large they seemed unreal, of an enemy that did not fear running out, because it never did. Among the ranks, the effect was devastating. Soldiers who had endured years of shortages now saw for the first time the scale of what they were facing. They compared the burned depots in Belgium to the empty rail yards back home. They thought of grounded aircraft, idle tanks, and factories silent for lack of fuel. Letters sent east spoke less of battles and more of inevitability. Not defeat in combat, defeat in capacity. Even senior commanders could no longer ignore it. Field reports acknowledged that the problem was not tactics or courage, but supply. Speer himself would later admit that once fuel production collapsed, Germany's fate was sealed. The Ardennes offensive had been meant to shock the Allies into negotiation. Instead, it revealed something far more damaging: that Germany and the United States were no longer fighting the same kind of war. The Ardennes offensive would continue for weeks on the maps. Battles would still be fought. Men would still die. Front lines would shift back and forth across frozen ground. But in a deeper sense, the outcome had already been settled. What Joachim Peiper encountered in Belgium was not merely an American fuel depot. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare, one where victory was determined long before armies ever met. Germany had entered the war with skill, discipline, and experience. The United States entered it with scale, factories that never stopped running, oil fields beyond the reach of bombers, supply lines that crossed oceans and continued to flow, no matter how much was burned, lost, or destroyed. In the Ardennes, German tanks did not fall to superior tactics or overwhelming firepower. They ran out of fuel. And when fuel disappeared, so did mobility. So did initiative. So did hope. The war did not end that winter. But it was there, among the burning depots and silent engines, that its final truth became undeniable. Germany was not defeated on the battlefield alone. It was defeated by an enemy it could not exhaust, an enemy whose greatest weapon was not a tank or a bomber, but the ability to keep going. If this story was worth remembering, it is because it reminds us that wars are not only won by courage or strategy, they are won by what a nation can sustain.